Now we're going to start part 2 of the endocrine system. In this section, we're going to cover learning outcomes 10.6, 10.7, 10.8, 10.9, 10.10, and 10.11. Let's begin. Let's talk about the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland has two parts, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. The adrenal gland has a second name called suprarenal gland. It's a yellow pyramid-shaped gland, and it sits on the superior border of each kidney. The adrenal cortex is the outer part, and the adrenal medulla is the inner part. Let's continue with the adrenal cortex. Number 1, it contains high levels of cholesterol and fatty acids. Number 2, it produces more than 24 steroid hormones called corticosteroids. They're essential for metabolic functions. They're also transported in the plasma bound to proteins, and there are 3 zones of the cortex, and they produce 3 types of mineral corticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens. This is just an illustration showing you the adrenal gland and the cortex and medulla. Now let's begin with mineral corticoids. Mineral corticoids are also called MCs. They're produced by the outer zone or the adrenal cortex. They affect the electrolyte balance in the body fluids, the sodium, potassium, and calcium. Aldosterone is a major mineral corticoid. It's secreted in response to low plasma sodium, low blood pressure, high plasma potassium, or the presence of angiotensin II. Glucocorticoids are also called GCs. They're produced mostly by the middle zone. They affect glucose metabolism or sugar metabolism. The most important are cortisol, corticosterone, and cortisone. They're secreted in response to ACTH. They increase the rates of glycolysis, glycogenesis that result in an increase in blood glucose levels. They also act as an anti-inflammatory. Next are the androgens. It's produced by the inner zone in both males and females. Some is converted to estrogens in plasma. In normal amounts, they do not affect sexual characteristics, and the function still remains unclear. Now let's talk about the adrenal medulla. The main thing I want you to know about the adrenal medulla is what we talked with the nervous system. The 2 hormones are epinephrine, E, or adrenaline. That's about 80%, and that's when we are going to fight or flight. And then norepinephrine, NE, or noradrenaline, is about 20%. It triggers metabolic changes to increase the availability of energy molecules. It also supports and prolongs overall sympathetic response. Make sure you know this table. It goes into all the hormones in the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla and tells you what are the mineral corticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens. Next is the pineal gland. It's located on the posterior portion of the roof of the third ventricle. It contains neurons, glial cells, and secretory cells that produce melatonin. Melatonin affects the rate of secretion affected by light and day, night cycles. It also plays a role in maintaining the circadian rhythms of the day-night cycles. It also may influence timing of sexual maturity, and it may protect the central nervous system with antioxidant activity. Now let's talk about the pancreas. The pancreas lies between the stomach and the proximal small intestine. It contains both exocrine and endocrine cells. The endocrine cells are located in the islets or the pancreatic islets. They're also called the islets of Langerhans, and it contains alpha cells that secrete the hormone glucagon that takes sugar out of the liver and puts it into the blood, and beta cells that secrete the hormone insulin that takes sugar out of the blood and puts it into the cell. This just shows you the pancreatic islets or the islets of Langerhans and the location of the pancreas. Now, the pancreas is very important in regulation of blood glucose. Increases in blood glucose levels activate the beta cells to release more insulin. So what that means is it stimulates glucose uptake by cells that have insulin receptors, except 1, neurons, 2, red blood cells, 3, epithelial cells of the kidney tubules, and 4, epithelial cells of the intestine lining. It also increases rates of protein synthesis and fat storage, and it can also result in a lower blood glucose level. A decrease in blood glucose levels activate the alpha cells to release more glucagon. What that does is mobilizes energy reserves. So it releases glycogen in the liver and muscles to be broken down to glucose. It also breaks down adipose tissue to release fatty acids, and proteins can be broken down to convert to glucose in the liver. This can result in a higher blood glucose level. Pancreatic regulation of blood glucose and the secretion of hormones is independent of any direct neural stimulus. There are some that are indirectly affected by the autonomic nervous system activity and any hormone that also influences blood glucose levels, for example, cortisol and thyroid hormones. Diabetes mellitus. Either hyposecretion of insulin or decreased sensitivity of insulin in the receptors is called diabetes mellitus. The symptoms include hyperglycemia, glycosuria, or polyuria. Study this image. It shows you the interaction of the beta cells and the alpha cells in maintaining blood glucose levels and how they maintain homeostasis. Normal blood glucose levels is 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. Now let's talk about the intestines. They secrete local hormones that coordinate digestive activities. They also have major control over the rate of digestive process, and they can be influenced by the autonomic nervous system. The kidneys. They release a few hormones. Calcitriol is stimulated by parathyroid hormone derived from vitamin D3, and it increases the absorption of calcium and phosphate ions from the gut. Erythropoietin is stimulated in the kidneys, hypoxia causing red blood cell production, and renin is an enzyme that triggers the hormonal chain reaction to increase blood pressure and blood volume. Let's talk about the heart. There are endocrine cells in the right atrium of the heart. They respond to increased blood volume entering the chamber. It's called ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. It promotes a loss of sodium and therefore water, inhibits renin release, and results in a decrease in blood pressure and blood volume. The thymus gland. It's located deep to the sternum in what's called the medius sternum. It's very active in early childhood and atrophies in adults. It secretes thymosins, and they aid in development and maintenance of the immune defenses. Now let's go over the gonads, specifically the testes. In males, it's the interstitial cells and they produce androgens. The most important androgen is testosterone. It promotes sperm production. It also determines the secondary sex characteristics. It also stimulates protein synthesis and sperm production effect balanced by inhibin. Next, we want to cover the ovaries, also gonads. In females, the ova are surrounded by follicles, and follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, triggers follicular cells to produce estrogens, and they support the maturation of the ova or egg and growth of the uterine lining, and inhibin provides negative feedback to FSH. Once the follicle releases the ovum, ovulation, the corpus luteum is formed. There's also releases progesterone, and that accelerates the fertilized egg movement through the uterine tube and prepares the uterus for the arrival of a developing embryo. All gonadal hormones are regulated by hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. Make sure you go over this table, and it goes over the gonads, the testes, and the ovaries, and their particular hormones. Now let's talk about adipose tissue or fat tissue. It produces a hormone leptin. This provides negative feedback control of appetite. It also helps to trigger satiation or fullness and the suppression of appetite. It has to be present for normal GN, RH, and gonadotropin synthesis. It can also lower body fat in late puberty and the cessation of menstrual cycles, and an increase in body fat can result in an increase in fertility. There are many hormonal interactions. There are antagonistic effects, those are called opposing effects. There are synergistic effects. The net result of the two is greater than the sum of their individual effects. There are permissive effects, the need for one hormone to be present for another to work, and there are integrative effects that coordinate diverse activities. These are the four possibilities of hormonal interactions. There are 6 key hormones required for normal human growth. Growth hormone is one of them. When there's an undersecretion, it causes dwarfism. When there's an oversecretion, it causes giantism. Thyroid hormone's number 2. They're required for normal nervous system development. Insulin, number 3. They're required for normal energy supply in growing cells. Number 4. Parathyroid hormone promotes calcium availability for normal bone growth. Calcitriol, same as parathyroid hormone. A lack of parathyroid hormone and calcitriol can result in rickets. And then reproductive hormones can affect the activity of osteoblasts and influence the secondary sex characteristic development. Let's talk about hormones and stress. Stress is triggered by physical injury or disease, number 1. Emotional responses, number 2, and they include anxiety or depression. 3, environmental conditions, extreme cold or heat. And 4, metabolic conditions, acute starvation. Stress triggers include the General Adaptation Syndrome, GAS principle. It's also called the stress response. In the stress response, the first phase is called the alarm phase, fight or flight. And that's the short-term response to crisis. Make sure you read this up close. Secondly, there's the resistance phase. The resistance phase begins if the stress lasts longer than a few hours. Glucocorticoids are the dominant hormones of the resistance phase. Make sure you read the long-term adjustments. And the third phase is called the exhaustion phase. This is when there's prolonged stress. The body's lipid reserves are sufficient to maintain the resistance phase for weeks or even months. But when the resistance phase ends, homeostatic regulation breaks down and exhaustion begins. Without immediately corrective actions, the ensuing failure of one or more organ systems will prove fatal. And that would be a collapse of vital systems. Remember, we earn, if we're talking about exercise and improving in athletics, we earn our results. E is for exercise, A is for attitude, R is for rest, recuperate, and recreate, and N is for nutrition. In the General Adaptation Syndrome, this graph shows where his baseline is and how if we adapt during the resistance phase, if we now get proper nutrition and rest, we'll actually improve. But if that goes on too long, we go into exhaustion. Hormones and behavior. The hypothalamus is the key hormone regulator. Behavior is affected by hormonal abnormalities. This can happen with sex hormones, also the central nervous system's intellectual functions like learning, memory, emotions can be altered in an adult due to hormonal imbalances. Hormones and aging. Usually most hormones remain pretty stable throughout adulthood. The exceptions are the reproductive hormones. The endocrine system interacts with the other body systems. The endocrine system provides a homeostatic regulation. It also adjusts the metabolic rate, and it also regulates growth and development. And this shows you the endocrine system interacting with all the other body systems. And this finishes the endocrine system.